In 1904, William Chase walked into the Philadelphia Police Department with blood still under his fingernails and made a confession that would shake the American medical establishment to its core. The 22-year-old medical student claimed he had just performed his 15th surgery on a living, conscious patient as part of his required coursework at the prestigious Harrington Medical College. But what made his confession truly horrifying wasn't just the admission of torture disguised as education, it was his detailed description of the systematic program that had turned aspiring healers into skilled torturers. Before we dive into what really happened behind the walls of America's most prestigious medical school, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about medical education in the late 1800s. The Philadelphia of 1885 was a city caught between two worlds. The Industrial Revolution had transformed it into one of America's great manufacturing centers, but beneath its veneer of progress lay the brutal realities of urban poverty, disease, and social inequality. It was against this backdrop that Dr. Marcus Harrington established what would become the most prestigious and most horrifying medical institution in American history. The Harrington Medical College promised to revolutionize medical education by providing students with unprecedented hands-on experience that would prepare them for the realities of modern medicine. What it actually provided was something far more sinister. Dr. Marcus Harrington was not your typical medical educator. Born into wealth in 1841, he had inherited a textile fortune that provided him with the resources to pursue his vision of medical education without concern for financial constraints or conventional ethical limitations. His academic credentials were impeccable: Harvard Medical School, followed by advanced study in Edinburgh and Vienna, where he had been exposed to the most progressive surgical techniques of his era. But it was his personality, rather than his qualifications, that would ultimately define the character of his institution. Those who knew Dr. Harrington described him as a man of extraordinary intelligence and utterly ruthless ambition. His colleagues at the Philadelphia Medical Society noted his brilliant insights into surgical technique, but also his disturbing lack of empathy for patient suffering. Dr. Harrington viewed medicine not as a healing art, but as a technical challenge to be mastered through systematic study and endless practice. He believed that the squeamishness that prevented most physicians from performing truly radical procedures was a weakness that could be overcome through proper conditioning and training. The Harrington Medical College opened its doors in September 1885 with a class of 24 carefully selected students. Dr. Harrington had personally interviewed each candidate, evaluating them not just for academic ability, but for what he termed surgical temperament, the capacity to remain focused and effective while causing extreme human suffering. The selection process was designed to identify young men who possessed the intelligence necessary for medical study, but who lacked the emotional sensitivity that might interfere with the educational methods Dr. Harrington had developed. The college's curriculum appeared conventional to outside observers. Students attended lectures on anatomy, physiology, and pathology that were indistinguishable from those offered at other medical institutions. They studied the same textbooks, took the same examinations, and received grades that reflected their mastery of standard medical knowledge. But it was the practical component of their education that set the Harrington Medical College apart from every other medical school in America. Dr. Harrington's revolutionary approach to surgical training was based on his belief that traditional medical education failed to prepare physicians for the psychological demands of surgery. Most medical schools of the era relied on dissection of cadavers and observation of experienced surgeons to teach practical skills. Dr. Harrington argued that this approach produced physicians who were technically competent but psychologically unprepared for the realities of cutting into living human tissue while patients screamed in agony. The solution, according to Dr. Harrington's educational philosophy, was to desensitize students gradually to human suffering while simultaneously providing them with extensive practice on living subjects. This approach would produce physicians who could maintain their concentration and surgical precision regardless of patient distress, while also ensuring that they possessed practical experience that far exceeded what conventional medical education could provide. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong with the Harrington Medical College came from the college's extraordinary success in placing graduates in prominent positions throughout American medicine. Harrington graduates consistently outperformed their peers from Harvard, Yale, and other prestigious institutions in both technical skill and psychological resilience. Surgeons trained at Harrington could perform procedures that left other physicians paralyzed with anxiety, and they did so with a calm efficiency that impressed medical observers throughout the country. William Chase had been attracted to the Harrington Medical College by exactly this reputation for producing superior physicians. The son of a middle-class Philadelphia merchant, Chase had worked for 3 years to save money for medical school tuition, motivated by a genuine desire to heal the sick and alleviate human suffering. His academic record was excellent, his references were spotless, and his interview with Dr. Harrington had convinced him that he had found an institution that would provide him with the best possible preparation for a career in medicine. Chase's first year at Harrington Medical College proceeded normally. His courses in anatomy and physiology were demanding but conventional, and his professors were knowledgeable and supportive. He excelled in his studies and quickly established himself as one of the most promising students in his class. It was only when he began his second year that he encountered the unique aspects of the Harrington educational program. The transition began subtly, with small adjustments to the standard curriculum that seemed designed to prepare students for the psychological challenges of medical practice. Students were required to attend dissections that focused not just on anatomical structure, but on the emotional responses that physicians must learn to control when confronted with human suffering. They studied case histories that emphasized the necessity of maintaining professional detachment even when treating patients whose conditions were particularly disturbing or tragic.
But it was the introduction of what Dr. Harrington called practical empathy training that marked the real beginning of Chase's transformation from aspiring healer to trained torturer. This component of the curriculum involved working with living patients who had been admitted to the college's small teaching hospital for treatment of various conditions. Students were instructed to observe these patients closely, not just for medical symptoms but for emotional and psychological responses to pain, fear, and helplessness. The patients who served as subjects for this empathy training were drawn from Philadelphia's most vulnerable populations: homeless individuals who had no family to inquire about their whereabouts, immigrants who spoke little English and had no understanding of their legal rights, and prostitutes who had been arrested and offered medical treatment as an alternative to imprisonment. These individuals had agreed to treatment at the Harrington Teaching Hospital without understanding what that treatment would actually involve. Chase's first direct participation in patient care came during his third semester, when he was assigned to assist with what Dr. Harrington described as advanced diagnostic procedures. These procedures involved techniques that were supposedly being developed to improve physicians' ability to understand internal conditions without relying solely on external symptoms. Students were taught to use various instruments to explore internal cavities, to test patient responses to different types of stimulation, and to document their observations with scientific precision. What Chase gradually realized was that these diagnostic procedures had no legitimate medical purpose. They were designed solely to provide students with experience in causing controlled pain while maintaining professional demeanor. Patients were subjected to increasingly invasive and painful examinations that were justified as necessary for their treatment, but which actually served only to condition medical students to remain calm and focused while inflicting suffering. The psychological conditioning that accompanied this practical training was sophisticated and systematic. Students were taught to view patient distress as valuable data rather than as human anguish. They learned to interpret screams as indicators of nerve function rather than as expressions of agony. Most importantly, they were conditioned to believe that their ability to remain detached and effective while causing pain was evidence of their professional competence and dedication to the advancement of medical science. Dr. Harrington reinforced this conditioning through a carefully designed system of rewards and punishments that shaped student behavior without making the manipulation obvious. Students who showed appropriate professional detachment during painful procedures received praise, better grades, and recommendations for prestigious internships. Those who displayed emotional responses to patient suffering were criticized for unprofessional behavior and warned that such weakness would prevent them from succeeding in medical practice. Chase's personal transformation during this period was gradual but profound. The young man, who had entered medical school with genuine compassion for human suffering, found himself becoming increasingly insensitive to patient distress. He learned to focus on technical aspects of procedures rather than on their human cost, and he began to take pride in his ability to maintain concentration even when patients begged him to stop what he was doing to them. The progression from diagnostic procedures to actual surgery followed the same pattern of gradual escalation that had characterized Chase's earlier conditioning. Students were initially assigned to assist with legitimate surgical procedures, holding instruments and observing while experienced physicians performed operations on patients who had consented to treatment. But these legitimate procedures were supplemented with what Dr. Harrington called experimental techniques that pushed the boundaries of accepted surgical practice. The experimental procedures were justified as research into new surgical methods that could potentially benefit future patients. Students were told that they were participating in groundbreaking research that would advance medical knowledge and improve treatment options for conditions that were currently untreatable. The fact that these procedures caused extreme suffering and had no realistic possibility of helping the patients on whom they were performed was presented as unfortunate but necessary for the greater good of medical progress. Chase's first independent surgical procedure was performed on Elena Rodriguez, a 19-year-old Mexican immigrant who had been arrested for prostitution and offered medical treatment for a respiratory condition as an alternative to imprisonment. Elena spoke little English and had no understanding of what the treatment would involve, but she had agreed to it because she had been told it would cure her chronic cough and allow her to return to her family in Mexico. The procedure that Chase performed on Elena was described in his surgical notes as an exploratory thoracic investigation to determine the relationship between respiratory symptoms and internal organ structure. In reality, it was a systematic dissection of Elena's chest cavity while she remained conscious and restrained. Chase made careful incisions to expose her ribs, then used specialized instruments to examine her lungs, heart, and other organs, while documenting her physiological responses to the various manipulations. Elena's surgery lasted for 4 hours and was conducted without any form of anesthesia. Harrington explained to his students that anesthesia would interfere with their ability to observe patient responses and would therefore reduce the educational value of the procedure. Elena was kept conscious throughout the operation so that students could study her reactions to different types of surgical intervention and learn to distinguish between various types of pain responses. Chase's surgical notes from Elena's operation reveal the complete psychological transformation that his medical education had achieved. He described Elena's screaming as vocalization consistent with respiratory distress, her attempts to escape from the restraints as involuntary muscular contractions, and her pleas for mercy as verbal expressions indicating retained consciousness. The young man who had entered medical school wanting to heal suffering had been systematically trained to view torture as educational opportunity. The success of Elena's surgery, from Dr. Harrington's perspective, was measured not by any improvement in her condition. She died from complications within hours of the procedure, but by Chase's ability to complete the operation without showing any emotional response to her suffering. Chase received his highest grade of the semester for this work, along with a commendation for his exceptional professional composure under challenging circumstances. Over the following 2 years, Chase performed 14 additional surgeries on patients who had been selected specifically for their vulnerability and lack of social connections. Each procedure was more complex and invasive than the last, as Dr. Harrington's curriculum was designed to provide students with progressively more challenging tests of their psychological conditioning and technical skill. By the time Chase reached his final semester, he was capable of performing procedures that would have horrified him when he first entered medical school. The systematic nature of the Harrington curriculum extended beyond individual student training to encompass the entire institutional culture of the medical college. Faculty members were selected not just for their medical expertise, but for their willingness to participate in and support the educational methods that Dr. Harrington had developed. Support staff, including nurses and administrative personnel, were carefully trained to view the unusual procedures conducted at the college as legitimate medical research rather than systematic torture. The patients who served as subjects for student training were managed through a sophisticated system that ensured their cooperation while minimizing the risk of outside interference. Patients were selected from populations that were unlikely to be missed if they disappeared, and their consent to treatment was obtained through a combination of deception, coercion, and exploitation of their desperate circumstances. Once admitted to the college's facility, patients were kept in conditions that prevented them from communicating with the outside world while they underwent the procedures that served as educational experiences for medical students. The college's relationship with Philadelphia's legal and social service systems provided a steady supply of vulnerable patients while protecting the institution from unwanted scrutiny. Police officers were paid to refer arrested individuals to the college for medical evaluation rather than processing them through normal legal channels. Social workers were encouraged to recommend the college's services to immigrants and other individuals who needed medical care but could not afford treatment at conventional hospitals. The financial arrangements that supported this system were complex and carefully concealed from outside observation. Dr. Harrington's personal wealth provided the initial funding for the college, but the institution also received substantial donations from wealthy Philadelphia families who believed they were supporting progressive medical education. Additional income came from tuition payments by students who had no idea what their education actually involved, and from payments by other medical institutions that purchased research data generated by the college's experimental procedures. By 1904, the Harrington Medical College had achieved a reputation as one of America's premier medical institutions. Its graduates held prominent positions at hospitals throughout the country, its research was cited in medical journals across the world, and its educational methods were being studied and adopted by other medical schools. The institution's success seemed to validate Dr. Harrington's belief that conventional medical education was inadequate for preparing physicians to deal with the psychological demands of modern surgical practice. But it was precisely this success that would ultimately lead to the college's downfall. The psychological conditioning that had enabled Chase and his fellow students to perform increasingly extreme procedures had also made them incapable of recognizing the moral boundaries that separated medical treatment from systematic torture. By the time Chase walked into the Philadelphia Police Department with blood under his fingernails, he had become a perfectly trained surgical technician who lacked any understanding of the ethical principles that were supposed to govern medical practice. Chase's confession to police would reveal not just his own crimes but the systematic program of conditioning and training that had created those crimes. His detailed description of the Harrington curriculum would expose an educational system that had succeeded in producing technically proficient physicians by systematically destroying their capacity for human empathy. The investigation that followed would uncover evidence of institutional abuse that challenged fundamental assumptions about medical education, professional ethics, and the relationship between scientific progress and human rights. Detective Captain James Morrison had handled his share of disturbing cases during 23 years with the Philadelphia Police Department, but nothing had prepared him for the confession that William Chase delivered on that cold October morning in 1904. Morrison had expected to spend the day processing routine arrests and minor disturbances, not listening to a well-dressed young man describe in clinical detail how he had tortured 15 human beings to death as part of his medical education. Morrison's initial reaction was skepticism. Chase appeared to be an intelligent, articulate individual with no obvious signs of mental illness or criminal background. His story was too detailed to be fabrication, too systematic to be delusion, and too horrible to be true. But the physical evidence that Chase had brought with him, bloody surgical instruments, detailed procedural notes, and anatomical sketches that could only have been made during actual operations, forced Morrison to take the confession seriously. The investigation that Morrison launched within hours of Chase's confession would ultimately expose the largest systematic abuse scandal in American medical history. But it began with the simple question that Morrison asked during Chase's initial interview: "If what you're telling me is true, then where are the bodies?" The college's basement levels contained a fully equipped surgical complex that was far more extensive than any legitimate medical education would require. Multiple operating theaters were equipped with restraining devices that could immobilize patients completely, monitoring equipment that could track vital signs during extended procedures, and drainage systems that could handle large quantities of blood and other bodily fluids. The sophistication of the equipment suggested that the facility had been designed specifically for procedures that would cause massive trauma to conscious patients. The evidence that Morrison found in Dr. Harrington's private office revealed the true scope of the college's educational program. Detailed files documented the backgrounds, medical conditions, and procedural histories of over 400 patients who had been used as subjects for student training exercises. Each file contained careful notes about the patient's responses to various surgical interventions, photographic documentation of procedures in progress, and analytical commentary about the educational value of different types of procedures. Perhaps most disturbing was Morrison's discovery of Dr. Harrington's correspondence with medical institutions throughout America and Europe. These letters revealed that the Harrington Medical College was not an isolated aberration, but part of a broader network of institutions that were experimenting with similar educational methods. Medical schools in Germany, Austria, and England were purchasing research data from the Harrington program and sharing information about their own experimental procedures. The systematic torture that Chase had described was apparently being conducted on an international scale. Morrison's investigation also uncovered the sophisticated recruitment system that the college had developed to ensure a steady supply of vulnerable patients. The institution maintained relationships with police departments, social service agencies, and immigration authorities that provided access to individuals who would not be missed if they disappeared. Payments were made to officials who referred suitable subjects to the college, and careful records were kept to ensure that the supply of patients remained adequate for the educational program's needs. The detectives' examination of the college's financial records revealed the economic incentives that had motivated the development of this system. While Dr. Harrington's personal wealth had provided initial funding for the institution, the college had become profitable through a combination of student tuition, research grants, and payments from other institutions that purchased data generated by the experimental procedures. The systematic torture of vulnerable patients had become a profitable business enterprise that generated substantial income for everyone involved. As Morrison's investigation expanded, he began to uncover evidence of the psychological conditioning program that had enabled medical students to participate in systematic torture while maintaining their belief that they were receiving legitimate medical education. The college had developed sophisticated techniques for gradually desensitizing students to human suffering, while simultaneously convincing them that their participation in increasingly extreme procedures was evidence of their professional competence and dedication to medical science. The conditioning program began with carefully designed courses in medical philosophy that emphasized the necessity of maintaining professional detachment in the face of patient suffering. Students were taught that emotional responses to pain and distress were signs of weakness that would interfere with their ability to provide effective medical care. They were encouraged to view patient discomfort as inevitable and temporary, while focusing on the long-term benefits that would result from their willingness to perform necessary but unpleasant procedures. This philosophical conditioning was reinforced through practical training exercises that exposed students to increasingly disturbing scenes of human suffering, while rewarding them for maintaining calm and professional demeanor. Students who showed appropriate detachment during painful procedures received better grades, more opportunities for advancement, and praise from faculty members. Those who displayed emotional reactions were criticized, penalized academically, and warned that such responses would prevent them from succeeding in medical practice. The effectiveness of this conditioning program was demonstrated by the willingness of otherwise moral and intelligent young men to participate in procedures that they would have found horrifying before their medical education began. Morrison's interviews with current and former students revealed that most had genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate medical research that would ultimately benefit future patients, even as they performed procedures that had no possible therapeutic value. Morrison's investigation revealed that the psychological conditioning used at the Harrington Medical College had been developed through systematic study of techniques used by military organizations to prepare soldiers for combat. Dr. Harrington had consulted with military psychologists and had adapted their methods for use in medical education. The result was a program that could transform compassionate individuals into efficient torturers while maintaining their belief that they were serving humanitarian purposes. The scope of the conditioning program extended beyond individual student training to encompass the entire institutional culture of the medical college. Faculty members, administrative staff and support personnel had all been subjected to similar psychological manipulation that enabled them to view systematic torture as legitimate educational activity. The institution had created a closed system where normal ethical constraints were systematically undermined and replaced with alternative moral frameworks that justified increasingly extreme behavior. As Morrison compiled evidence from his investigation, he began to understand that the Harrington Medical College represented something far more sinister than individual criminal activity or even institutional corruption. The college had demonstrated that systematic torture could be disguised as education, that intelligent and well-intentioned individuals could be conditioned to participate in atrocities, and that professional credentials and institutional reputation could provide protection for the most horrific crimes. The investigation also revealed the broader implications of the Harrington program for American medical education. The techniques developed at the college were being studied and adopted by other institutions, creating the possibility that systematic abuse was spreading throughout the medical education system. The students who had graduated from Harrington were now practicing physicians at hospitals across the country, carrying with them the psychological conditioning and technical skills that their education had provided. Morrison's discovery of the international network that had supported the Harrington program raised even more disturbing questions about the scope of systematic medical abuse. The correspondence between Dr. Harrington and his colleagues in Europe suggested that similar programs were operating in multiple countries, sharing information and coordinating their activities to maximize their collective impact on medical education. The torture techniques developed in Philadelphia were being refined and expanded through collaboration with institutions throughout the Western world. The evidence that Morrison had compiled by November 1904 was overwhelming and undeniable. The Harrington Medical College had systematically tortured hundreds of vulnerable individuals while training medical students to view such torture as normal and necessary. The institution had operated with the knowledge and support of prominent members of Philadelphia society, the medical establishment, and government officials who had been paid to provide protection and cooperation. But Morrison's investigation had also revealed the obstacles that would prevent full prosecution of the crimes he had uncovered. The individuals and institutions implicated in the Harrington program possessed wealth, political connections, and professional standing that would make it difficult to pursue criminal charges. The international scope of the network suggested that prosecution in any single jurisdiction would only address a small part of a much larger system of abuse. Most troubling of all was Morrison's realization that the psychological conditioning techniques developed at the Harrington Medical College could not be easily undone. The physicians who had been trained through systematic participation in torture would carry the effects of that conditioning throughout their careers, potentially affecting their treatment of patients for decades to come. The institutional culture that had enabled systematic abuse at one medical college could potentially spread to other institutions if not addressed through fundamental reforms in medical education and oversight. As Morrison prepared to present his findings to prosecutors and medical authorities, he understood that his investigation had uncovered not just criminal activity but evidence of systematic failures in American institutions that had allowed such activity to flourish undetected for nearly 2 decades. The Harrington Medical College had demonstrated the fragility of ethical constraints and the ease with which systematic abuse could be disguised as professional education when conducted by individuals with sufficient wealth, credentials, and social connections. Detective Captain Morrison's investigation should have resulted in the largest medical scandal in American history. The evidence he had compiled was overwhelming: detailed confessions from multiple students, physical evidence of systematic torture, financial records proving institutional corruption, and documented proof of an international network engaged in systematic human experimentation. But when Morrison submitted his final report to the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office in December 1904, he discovered that justice would be sacrificed to protect institutional interests that were far more powerful than individual human rights. District Attorney Charles Wellington's initial response to Morrison's report was one of professional outrage and determination to prosecute all individuals involved in the Harrington program to the fullest extent of the law. Wellington had built his political career on a reputation for integrity and commitment to justice, and the evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical education seemed to present exactly the kind of clear-cut case that would enhance his standing with voters while serving the cause of justice. But Wellington's resolve began to weaken as the political and economic implications of prosecution became clear. Within 48 hours of receiving Morrison's report, Wellington found himself facing pressure from some of Philadelphia's most powerful individuals and institutions. The mayor's office received calls from prominent businessmen who had donated to the Harrington Medical College and who would face financial and reputational damage if their support for the institution became public knowledge. The governor's office was contacted by medical professionals throughout Pennsylvania who argued that prosecution of the Harrington case would damage public confidence in medical education and healthcare throughout the state. The pressure applied to Wellington went far beyond political persuasion. His law practice received threats that major corporate clients would terminate their relationships if he proceeded with prosecution. His wife was informed that her position on the board of Philadelphia's most prestigious charity would be terminated if the case went forward. Most significantly, Wellington was told that his own political future would be destroyed if he pursued charges that would implicate prominent Philadelphia families in systematic criminal activity. The campaign to suppress the Harrington investigation was coordinated by a consortium of interests that included medical institutions, wealthy families who had supported the college, and political figures who had benefited from donations and other considerations provided by Dr. Harrington and his associates. This consortium possessed sufficient resources and influence to ensure that prosecution would be prevented regardless of the strength of the evidence or the severity of the crimes involved. The medical establishment's opposition to prosecution was motivated by concerns that extended far beyond the specific crimes committed at the Harrington Medical College. The techniques developed by Dr. Harrington had been studied and adopted by medical schools throughout America and Europe, creating the possibility that prosecution would expose systematic abuse at institutions across the Western world. The American Medical Association faced the prospect that investigation of the Harrington program would reveal that they had endorsed and promoted educational methods that constituted systematic torture. Harvard Medical School, Yale Medical School, and other prestigious institutions had incorporated elements of the Harrington curriculum into their own programs, potentially making them accessories to systematic criminal activity. The University of Pennsylvania had received research data generated by the Harrington program and had published studies based on that data in prominent medical journals. The exposure of the true source of this research would necessarily implicate the entire academic medical establishment in systematic abuse. The international implications of the Harrington case presented additional obstacles to prosecution. Dr. Harrington's correspondence with European colleagues had revealed that similar programs were operating in Germany, Austria, England, and France. Prosecution in Philadelphia would necessarily expose this international network, potentially creating diplomatic incidents and trade disputes that would affect American relationships with major European powers. The State Department made it clear that prosecution of the Harrington case could not be permitted to proceed if it would compromise American foreign policy interests. The financial interests threatened by prosecution of the Harrington case were substantial and widespread. The medical equipment manufacturers who had supplied the college's sophisticated torture devices faced the prospect of criminal liability and massive civil lawsuits if their complicity became public knowledge. Pharmaceutical companies that had purchased research data generated by the college's experimental procedures would face similar exposure. Insurance companies that had provided coverage for the college's activities would be liable for claims that could exceed their capacity to pay. The consortium working to suppress the investigation employed a multifaceted strategy that combined legal challenges, political pressure, and financial incentives to ensure that prosecution would not proceed. Wellington was offered lucrative employment opportunities that would become available only if he declined to prosecute the case. Key witnesses were relocated to positions in other states where they would be difficult to compel to testify. Physical evidence was challenged through motions that questioned the legality of the search warrants used to obtain it. Most significantly, William Chase himself was persuaded to recant his confession and claim that he had been suffering from a mental breakdown when he had made his initial statements to police. Chase was provided with financial compensation, a new identity, and a position at a medical institution in California where his participation in the Harrington program would not be known to his colleagues or patients. His recantation eliminated the primary witness whose testimony would have been necessary for successful prosecution. The suppression of the Harrington investigation required the active cooperation of multiple institutions and hundreds of individuals who chose institutional loyalty over moral responsibility. Police officers were instructed to reclassify evidence as lost or misfiled. Medical examiners revised autopsy reports to eliminate references to suspicious injuries. Hospital administrators destroyed records that might contradict official explanations of patient outcomes. The conspiracy to suppress the investigation was facilitated by the same institutional culture that had enabled the original crimes to occur. Individuals who might have been expected to oppose the cover-up found themselves trapped by their previous complicity or silence. Medical professionals who had ignored evidence of abuse at the Harrington Medical College could not expose the cover-up without implicating themselves in the original crimes. Academic institutions that had endorsed the college's methods could not oppose the suppression without acknowledging their own failure to investigate obvious ethical violations. The psychological impact of the cover-up on those who knew the truth about the Harrington program was devastating. Detective Morrison, despite his years of experience with criminal cases, found himself unable to cope with the knowledge that systematic torture had been protected by the same institutions that were supposed to ensure justice and accountability. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1919, document 15 years of nightmares, depression, and alcohol abuse stemming from his failure to achieve justice for the college's victims. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a physician who had attempted to investigate suspicious activities at the Harrington Medical College in 1903, was systematically excluded from Philadelphia's medical community after the cover-up began. Her medical license was suspended on fabricated charges. Her research was plagiarized by colleagues who received credit for her discoveries, and she was ultimately forced to leave Pennsylvania to find employment in her profession. Her attempts to publicize the truth about the Harrington program were dismissed as the vindictive accusations of a disgraced physician seeking revenge against former colleagues. The cover-up of the Harrington investigation established precedents that would influence how institutional abuse cases were handled for decades to come. The demonstration that wealthy and powerful interests could prevent prosecution regardless of the strength of evidence or the severity of crimes sent a message throughout American society that certain types of systematic abuse would be protected if they involved sufficiently prominent perpetrators. The techniques used to suppress the Harrington investigation became a template for protecting institutional interests from criminal accountability. Legal challenges that delayed prosecution until public attention moved to other issues, witness intimidation disguised as employment opportunities, and the manipulation of media coverage to minimize public awareness of institutional crimes would all become standard methods for preventing accountability when powerful interests were threatened by criminal investigation. The international network that had supported the Harrington program continued to operate after the American investigation was suppressed. Medical schools throughout Europe maintained their experimental programs, sharing information and coordinating activities through communications channels that had been established during the college's operation. The techniques developed in Philadelphia were refined and expanded through collaboration between institutions that faced no risk of prosecution or public exposure. The students who had been trained at the Harrington Medical College continued their medical careers throughout the United States, carrying with them the psychological conditioning and technical skills that their education had provided. Many achieved prominent positions in American medicine, becoming department heads at major hospitals, professors at prestigious medical schools, and leaders of professional medical organizations. Their influence on American medical practice extended far beyond their individual careers, as they trained subsequent generations of physicians who inherited both their technical expertise and their conditioned indifference to patient suffering. The systematic torture techniques developed at the Harrington Medical College were eventually adopted by military and intelligence organizations that recognized their potential applications for interrogation and psychological warfare. The detailed documentation of human responses to various forms of controlled trauma proved valuable to agencies that needed to extract information from unwilling subjects or to break down individual resistance to authority. The medical legitimacy that had originally disguised these techniques made them more acceptable to officials who might have been reluctant to authorize obviously criminal methods. The cover-up of the Harrington investigation had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the specific crimes that had been committed at the medical college. The demonstration that systematic abuse could be protected through institutional influence and financial resources encouraged similar programs at other institutions that recognized they could operate without fear of meaningful accountability. The precedent established by the suppression of the investigation would be cited in later cases where powerful interests sought to prevent prosecution of systematic crimes. Modern medical education still bears the influence of techniques developed at the Harrington Medical College, though the connection is rarely acknowledged and never discussed openly. Contemporary medical training continues to emphasize the importance of maintaining professional detachment in the face of patient suffering, using methods that can be traced directly to the psychological conditioning programs pioneered by Dr. Harrington. The institutional culture that enables systematic abuse in medical settings was established during the Harrington era and has persisted despite changes in formal ethical guidelines and oversight mechanisms. The victims of the Harrington Medical College were never acknowledged, never mourned, and never avenged. Their suffering was transformed into medical knowledge, their deaths were disguised as educational experiences, and their identities were erased from all official records. The 400 individuals who had been tortured to death in the name of medical education became anonymous casualties of an institutional system that valued professional advancement above human rights. The long-term psychological effects on the physicians who had been trained through systematic participation in torture became evident in the decades following the cover-up. Studies conducted in the 1920s and 1930s revealed that Harrington graduates showed significantly higher rates of substance abuse, domestic violence, and suicide than physicians trained at other institutions. Their conditioning to view human suffering as educational opportunity had created psychological damage that affected not only their professional practice but their personal relationships and mental health. The institutional culture that had enabled the Harrington program spread to other medical schools through the placement of graduates in teaching positions and administrative roles. By 1920, elements of the Harrington curriculum had been adopted by over 30 medical institutions across America, though the connection to the original program was carefully concealed through euphemistic language and indirect references. The systematic desensitization techniques that had been developed to enable torture were repackaged as methods for developing professional resilience and clinical objectivity. The research data generated by the Harrington program continued to influence medical practice for decades after the college's closure. Surgical techniques, pharmaceutical applications, and diagnostic procedures that had been developed through systematic torture were incorporated into standard medical textbooks without acknowledgement of their criminal origins. Physicians throughout the world unknowingly utilized knowledge that had been obtained through the systematic abuse of vulnerable patients. The cover-up of the Harrington investigation demonstrated how institutional interests could override individual justice when sufficient resources and influence were applied to suppress inconvenient truths. The conspiracy that protected the college's crimes became a model for subsequent cover-ups that would protect powerful interests from accountability for systematic abuse. The precedent established in Philadelphia would be cited and emulated whenever institutional survival was threatened by evidence of criminal activity. The modern implications of the Harrington case extend far beyond historical curiosity about early medical education. The techniques developed for conditioning individuals to participate in systematic torture while maintaining their belief in their own moral righteousness have been studied and adapted by organizations throughout the world that need to overcome normal human resistance to causing suffering. Military training programs, intelligence agencies, and authoritarian governments have all drawn upon the psychological insights generated by the Harrington program. The institutional mechanisms that enabled the Harrington program to operate undetected for nearly 2 decades continue to exist in contemporary medical education and healthcare systems. The same combination of professional credentialism, institutional reputation, and regulatory capture that protected Dr. Harrington's crimes can still be found in modern medical institutions that prioritize organizational interests above patient welfare. The culture of professional silence that prevented earlier exposure of the Harrington program remains a powerful force that protects institutional abuse from public scrutiny. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that the Harrington case was not unique, but representative of a broader pattern of systematic abuse that has characterized institutional medicine throughout its development. The techniques pioneered at the college were not aberrations but logical extensions of an institutional culture that views patients as raw material for professional advancement rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and protection. The confession that William Chase delivered to Detective Morrison in 1904 should have marked the beginning of fundamental reforms in medical education and professional oversight. Instead, it became evidence in a case that was suppressed to protect institutional interests that were considered more important than individual human rights. The blood under Chase's fingernails when he surrendered to police represented not just his personal crimes but the moral stains that continue to mark American medicine more than a century after the Harrington Medical College was quietly closed and its records were sealed forever. The statistical reality of the Harrington case: 400 victims, 0 survivors, complete institutional protection for systematic torture disguised as education, serves as a permanent reminder of how easily systematic abuse can be concealed when institutions prioritize their own survival above moral responsibility. The young man who walked into the Philadelphia Police Department hoping to confess his crimes and achieve some measure of justice for his victims discovered that institutional power could transform even the most damning evidence into protected secrets that would never see the light of legal accountability. The Harrington Medical College stands as proof that the most horrific crimes can be committed in plain sight when they are disguised as professional activity and protected by institutional authority. The systematic torture of 400 human beings was conducted with the knowledge and support of Philadelphia's medical, political, and social establishment, demonstrating that evil does not require secrecy when it possesses sufficient respectability and influence. In the end, William Chase's confession accomplished nothing except his own destruction. The young man who had hoped to atone for his crimes by exposing the system that had created them found himself silenced, relocated, and ultimately forgotten. His attempt to achieve justice became instead a demonstration of how completely institutional power could overcome individual conscience when the stakes were sufficiently high and the resources adequately deployed. The blood under his fingernails washed away, but the stains on American medical education remain permanently embedded in institutional practices that continue to prioritize professional advancement above human dignity.